Our resident lawyer, Despina Priala of boutique law firm Priala Legal in Runaway Bay, with us every Thursday, thank goodness, to offer her legal advice and her expertise. We certainly have been needing it recently by providing some general advice on the latest hot topics. Of course, having experience spanning more than 25 years in the area of property and commercial law. She joins us once again this morning. Hello to you, Despina.
Good morning, Wayne. Good morning, Brooke.
Good morning, Despina. So yes, we'll be discussing a bunch of topics this morning that basically recaps what has happened this past week. So Despina, what developments have been going on?
Look, a lot of developments since last week, and we don't have time to canvass them all. But I thought I'd mention a few and then talk about a couple of individual cases and people that have reached out to me over the last week to talk about these issues that are affecting them on a daily basis. So the federal government has announced an indemnity scheme to protect employers who may face claims to facilitate jabs in the workplace. So what does that mean? So a lot of the larger companies such as BHP, Wesfarmers, Qantas, they're talking about, and I know that BHP has committed to setting up vaccination hubs for their employees. So voluntary vaccination hubs, not mandatory, where they're saying to employees, look, if you want to get the jab, we're going to facilitate it, make it easy for you. We're going to set up this for the company and for its employees. And I think the overarching goal, of course, like with the government, is these companies are trying to help the government, I believe, in reaching this 80% goal where they want, up to 80% at least vaccination rate to be achieved. And I think the federal government, by announcing this indemnity scheme, is one step closer then to helping big companies, not small companies because they wouldn't have the resources, but big companies like BHP, for example, that can set this up and have a step closer perhaps towards achieving that 80% vaccination rate.
All right, indemnity scheme, what are they indemnifying against?
Well, apparently, and the information is still sketchy at the moment, but it's supposed to be assisting employers with any claims in relation to getting reactions or injuries from the vaccine per se. So you can imagine if an employer, a big company, sets up a vaccination hub and they're doing it, obviously voluntary. Yes, the employees get a vaccine facilitated by their employer, but then they get a reaction. Is the employer going to be covered? And that's what this is all about. So the federal government has announced this to help those employers. And I think that's important in the scheme of things with changes moving forward. The other development is that the government has talked about and apparently is committed to putting in a compensation claim scheme for people. But again, we don't have that information. But apparently this general vaccine claim scheme will be facilitated by the government at some point and apparently will be backdated to the start of the national vaccine rollout in February this year. And, of course, other things that I've heard recently too, which may be of interest to people, expats who have received the vaccinations overseas will now be recognised by the Australian government.
Oh, wow.
So that's an important development, yes, so they can actually return to Australia. So that's another development. And in Queensland in particular, quarantine facilities being set up. So from last week's show, when we talked about these issues to now, there was another direction issued. So remember last week we talked about how these directions are being rolled out or almost published on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. And it's hard to keep up with the changes. So one of the directives was, well, all the quarantine hotels in Queensland are maxed out. So even if you could come over the border and complying with all the rules and you slotted into one of those conditions
there was no
exemptions.
Room. There was no room.
There's no room. There's no room for you to be quarantined. So they said, well, you can't come over the border anyway. So Queensland apparently has announced a proposal to set up quarantine facilities where they could have up to, say, 1,000 beds, for example, to help with this issue. And I think they're looking at Toowoomba at the moment. So that's an important step that the government's making. But in the overall scheme of things, for people like you and me and the ordinary person, they're still being impacted on a daily basis quite substantially, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. And you've obviously had people call in, a number of them, and share their experiences individually. One in particular was our listener, Andrew. Good morning, Andrew. And he mentioned obviously being a truck driver this week has been a downright mess for them.
It has, and Andrew reached out to me, and I was so pleased to hear from him. And he called me on my mobile. We had a good chat last week. And hi, Andrew, I know you're listening. So thank you for listening to the show as well. And I'm glad you enjoy it. He's in a situation. He's a truck driver, and he explained to me recently that he had an experience where he was coming over the border, obviously as a truck driver, driving interstate. And these truck drivers, I have to say, they've really kept the country going because they are the ones
100%.
that have been delivering, various goods to people all around the country. And I really take my hat off to all these truck drivers because I think it's an enormous job for them and a lot of pressure. Particularly through COVID. So I really say thank you to all of them because they've kept, supermarkets going and all sorts of other companies that require goods to be delivered. So he was explaining to me over the border, there was a blitz north of Runaway Bay here, and they were all stopped and they were all fined. Now, the reason they were fined, and they weren't cheap fines, they were $4,000 to $5,000 worth, which is quite, very substantial.
Yes.
And that's because they didn't comply, and they were apparently travelling from a COVID hotspot. Now, here's the tricky bit, and the unfortunate bit is when Andrew explained to me, when he filled out all those declarations as the driver, and he explained that I filled it out honestly, of course, and said that I hadn't been in a COVID hotspot and I was travelling from all these places. From the time he filled the declaration form out to actually when he crossed the border to that checkpoint,
they changed the rules.
It changed. And apparently he had been in a COVID hotspot and he didn't know about it. And he tried to explain that to the law enforcement officers. And unfortunately, as I said last week, they're caught up as well with having to enforce these laws, which aren't black and white, and having to make that decision and determination if someone has breached these laws and then issue a fine. So apparently he had breached the laws. He wasn't aware of it. He got the fine. And then and that was a very unfortunate event.
And to clarify quickly too, Despina, as well, he filled out that form and it wasn't a space of 2 weeks or anything crazy. We're talking the matter of, less than 24 hours, which is terrible. Which is terrible. So this isn't like he's gone on this huge journey for days and days. This is a matter of him filling it out the night before, and maybe he crossed at 5 p.m. or something, and then he got booked. That's not fair.
Exactly. And this is the problem with the system, isn't it? Because if you're constantly changing, as I said last week, it's really not complying with the rule of law, where laws have to be clear and concise so people can easily be able to follow them and understand them, and then they can easily be enforced. And that's not the case with these directions and orders. Well, one of the reasons is they're constantly changing.
Yep.
And then how are people...
how they're supposed to keep up, and especially if you're on the road. I mean, you're out there for hours and hours and hours sitting behind the wheel. How can you possibly expect to be keeping up with rules that are changing by the day and sometimes by half a day, by the hour? Yeah.
I just don't see how you can.
No,
I really don't. And that's when I talk to him about, well, really the burden and the obligation should be passed to some extent to the employer.
Yeah.
Because, yes, the employer is not the one doing the driving and travelling through different areas. I understand that. Practically, the driver is the one that would need to complete a declaration. However, if the driver ends up being in a situation which Andrew faced recently, who should actually pay the fine? If the driver acts honestly and believes he's doing the right thing, then why should the employee cop the fine? The employer should take some of that burden, and the employer should also be manning those changes happening. You see? So if you've got someone in the office who knows where their employees are driving from point A to point B, and if they're aware and getting updates with changes that are happening, COVID changes and directions and orders, there should be an obligation of the burden. I say, well, they've got to deal with that. They've got to notify their employees. So their employees, who are quite valuable to their business, are updated.
For
so
sure.
ensuring that they comply.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's ridiculous that he would have to pay thousands of dollars. And it wasn't just Andrew, like he mentioned.
There were many of them.
There were many. So that's just very, very sad. And just moving on to another caller as well, Lisa, who works in pathology on the Gold Coast. Can you explain what she wanted to know?
Yeah, so another situation, again, and we're trying to help listeners out there, and I understand it's very difficult times for everybody. So Lisa called and she listens to the show, or her mother actually listens, so that was very nice. And She does work for a pathology company on the Gold Coast. She's concerned about mandatory vaccines coming into place because apparently the health employees in New South Wales will be required to take the vaccine, or they already are required to take the vaccine now if they work in that environment. So to talk about, and she's concerned about what's going to happen in Queensland, but this sort of flows on from what I was talking about a couple of weeks ago, and that is, can employers mandate in the workplace that they have the vaccine? So my views haven't changed from a couple of weeks ago, and that is, it's got to be lawful and reasonable, and the employers shouldn't be too quick to just simply mandate vaccines, because the cases this year with the Fair Work Commissioner have talked about high-risk categories, such as aged care, such as childcare, that have been that has been determined that they are industries where people should be vaccinated and it should be mandatory. So, but that doesn't mean that everybody should then mandate in their workplace. The employer has to take advice, listen to that advice if it's reasonable, make a fair and reasonable decision as to whether these there should be a mandated direction about vaccines, taking into account what type of business is it, how the employees work, do they work together, are they distance, what do they deal with? So this person works for a pathology company. My view is, if you're working for that type of company where you're dealing with samples maybe, and you're dealing with, because not everybody that works for pathology companies deals with samples. They could be doing x-rays or other things, but you are in close proximity with people when you're doing tests or when you're checking samples. So I think it's inevitable that will follow into Queensland. And I think for employees in working for pathology companies or other companies where it could be considered high risk, I think that ultimately it'll probably end up being that they will have to have at least one dose of the vaccine given the work environment that they're in, that they're going to be placed in, because of the health risks. And that's what employers need to consider. And if an employee, for some reason, feels that they're not fit to take the vaccine, or their health conditions might mandate or warrant that they shouldn't take the vaccine, then if that's the case, they should talk to their GP or specialist about their own medical conditions, if they have any, and get that advice if they are okay to take the vaccine. I think that's important.
Yep, because everyone's different, of course, so everyone will have different situation as far as their health goes, and whether they are, in fact, well, whether they should actually have a vaccine or which one they should have.
Yeah, exactly. That is Despina Priala from Priala Legal. Stay tuned. We'll be discussing court case that has determined who and who isn't a casual employee. Stay tuned.